Hello, welcome to the Why God Why podcast. My name is Peter Englert. I am brought to you by this podcast is brought to you by Browncroft Community Church, hence why I'm wearing the pullover. Man, I am struggling with intros today, Aaron. So Aaron's my wonderful co-host that keeps me on track, and he is intelligent, smart, and illustrious. And then we have our awesome producer, Nathan Yoder, here with us today. We are interviewing a guest. Her name is Ashley Hales. She's an author. She has her PhD, a mother, and a wife. And I'm sure the list could go on. She recently wrote a book called A Spacious Life. And the question we're dealing with today is, why is hustle overrated? Aaron, you have any thoughts?
I'm excited about this conversation. I think it's an important one. I'm really looking forward to talking to Ashley. And, I'll just back up for a second. I mean, you started off with illustrious for me. I can't, it seems like it's going to be a good episode anyways, no matter what at this point. But by the way, he's wearing his Browncroft polo. I didn't wear it today. Maybe I should have, but then we could be twins almost. I think this is going to be a great conversation. I think this is the idea of hustle and spaces are something that we need to talk more about in our culture. So I think this will be a great conversation.
Before I throw to Ashley, I don't usually get to read books before we interview people, but I actually got to read this. I just want to read just a little segment of it, so to just help frame this conversation.
Nice.
So yeah, there we go. We try to be big. We ignore the needs of our body. We drink too much coffee and skimp on sleep. We measure our worth on our social media feeds or by a number in the bank or on a scale. We've transgressed the limits of our attention and care, cramming too much in our calendars, walking past our family and neighbors in favor of what we have set out to accomplish. When I've gone past God-given limits, choosing instead to try to earn through hustle what I've already been given, the gracious care of God, I end up weary, overwhelmed, confused, and discontented. That's quite a segment. So, Ashley, why don't you introduce yourself and share your story, and we'll go from there.
Sure. Yeah. So I am Ashley Hales. I'm married to my husband, Bryce, for almost 20 years, which is really cool. And we live in Colorado. We moved from Southern California, where we grew up. My husband had been in church planting, and now he is a pastor of spiritual formation. We have 4 kids, 2 in middle school, 2 in elementary school. It took me about a decade to finish my PhD, but I did it just on sheer grit. I think, I have found my limits in lots of different seasons, but particularly we have 4 kids. They're 6 years apart from the oldest to the youngest. So we had lots of baby years. And I think that was one thing for me, at least in my story, that really helped shape me and shaped my character and made me extremely dependent on God in ways I probably didn't want to be. And so that is something I look back on now about 15 years later and realize that our limits of our body, our attention, our time, our calling are good. God created us to be creatures, to be finite. And that means that we get to act like a kid who is cared for by our loving Heavenly Father. So they're actually gifts, but I think that's really countercultural to so much of what we've heard just growing up. And it feels like it's just in the water, especially in American life.
Wow. No, that's great. Thank you for introducing yourself too. And I'm really excited to talk about this. I know the basic gist will be talking about hustle, and I know we'll get to that. But you were just even mentioning having, that range of your kids, trying to find space in that environment. I'm sure that is a growing experience. I know that you gotta find it and find rest. Rest is certainly something I think we in our culture struggle with. So no, this is gonna be great. I am curious. You are. We just mentioned your mom. You're also. You mentioned you're the wife of a pastor. I think this episode is dropping in the holiday season, so that'll also be a time when there's a lot of hustle. I'm sure for everybody, but certainly for you in the church setting. But I'm curious. You mentioned your journey a bit. If you were to talk back to the person before, you've grown a lot over the years. What would you, do you have something that you would say to yourself now on this end of things? What do you kind of wish that you would have told yourself back then that you wish you knew then?
Yeah, I think it's something we try to tell our children a little bit now, as our oldest will be going to high school next year, and which I'm like, how am I old enough to have a high schooler? I don't know, because wasn't I just in high school? But I think we try to remind him, and there's been a lot of moms actually who have reached out, who have read A Spacious Life, who have found this tension between longing and desires of their own heart and their own lives and vocation and calling, and then also the calling of being a mom, and maybe they're staying home with kids, and it feels like, on the one hand, I want to do all these things and I have desires to do them. And then the other hand, like, I have cleaned up under the high chair 100 times already today. Like, there's a disconnect, it feels like. And for both, my high schooler and for these women who have kind of reached out after reading A Spacious Life, I've encouraged them to remember that the character really is our calling, and so much more than what we accomplish. Because I think we are in kind of Western individualistic cultures, we think we can get to a meaningful life through hustle and hurry, but it's precisely those methodologies that won't help us actually get there. So instead of like choosing to jump on kind of that moving walkway of hustle and hurry, we are offered another invitation from God to actually acknowledge our limits, to say, I'm tired, like, I need help, basic things, because we aren't meant to do everything. We aren't meant to be our own saviors. And to remember that in those hard, very kind of claustrophobic, limit-inducing moments or seasons of our lives, that we are actually becoming someone new as we like lean into those limits. And so I would encourage folks who are feeling that press of their limits, whether it's through parenting or whether it's, financially or physical, chronic illness. There's so many different ways in which we are forced to reckon with our limits. But, as you are feeling that push, is to say, I actually get to go through that with Christ. And who I am becoming is really the thing, not what I accomplish.
I'm just kind of curious because, you mentioned writing this as a mom, a PhD. I guess I read this as a father kind of, working. What are the differences of hustle, between men and women? What are some of those observations? Because we have I'm sure we have some 20-somethings that are aspiring for a career, but they want the family life. We have some even couples in their 30s, and there's just different expectations on men and women. And I guess I'd be curious, how is that different from your vantage point?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I would love to hear, you can give me the father and male version. And, not obviously there's a lot of overlap, but Ada Calhoun, she wrote a book called Why We Can't Sleep, and talking about women's midlife crisis. And she writes a little bit about, particularly in the 70s through the 90s, and I think we still reap these consequences today, but that we've kind of had this experiment in crafting a higher achieving, more fulfilled, and more well-rounded version of the American woman. So it's expected, right, that women are not only to be fantastic mothers and like make all the food from scratch, but they're also expected to, be on the PTA, and they're probably expected to also hold down this really satisfying job and, be in great shape and have an amazing sex life with her husband and volunteer at church, in Christian spheres. And I think things like Instagram will kind of push us to thinking that women particularly, who can tend to be the audience for Instagram, that we are supposed to be all of these things all of the time. And really what Ada Calhoun talks about is that's actually producing so much more mental health problems and just physical problems with these unrealistic expectations. I imagine men, it might look a little different, but there is still this sense that, of course, you're supposed to be on the soccer field and coaching your kid. You're supposed to be earning enough money to take your family on great vacations. You're supposed to, be the spiritual leader of your household. There's so many different ways it might look. But, you know, this idea that you're supposed to be doing all of the things and being all things to all people at all times really doesn't reckon with the fact that we're human and that, you know, we have particular giftings and callings and particular seasons of our lives where we are not able to be firing on all cylinders.
So just to lean in a little bit, because in some ways, I think what brings men and women together, or whatever stage that you're in, whether you're single or married, is we hear this American phrase, you can be whatever you want to be. After writing this book, what do you think about that phrase?
Yeah, I think it's horrible. Because we can't be everything we want to be. And, you know, at some point you maybe in your high school and you realize, oh, I cannot be a professional soccer player. Like I do not have the skills or, you know, the DNA to be able to play like Messi. And, you know, and so you have to reckon with disappointment all along the way. We're really not doing children much good too, if we're telling them you can be anything. Obviously, we want to help them be imaginative and explore options. But really, when, you know, kids grow up with that attitude of you can be anything, and they haven't been that famous soccer player, or, you know, they got cut from the team as a freshman, or, you know, they suddenly get a C in geometry, they've really learned to tie their worth to their achievements. And if instead, as parents and as people, you know, as we get a little bit of life experience, we actually have an invitation to move through our limits and to see them not only as, I'm just being held back somehow by the system or myself, and we wallow in guilt and shame, but actually to say, you know what, Jesus, who was perfectly God and perfectly human, had limits. We see him taking naps. We see him healing people, but not every single person in Galilee did he heal. We see him going off to pray in the middle of the night. We see him choosing 12 men to be his disciples, not every single person. You know, that he invested in particular people. He healed particular people. He prioritized things like rest and sleep and Sabbath. And maybe we should follow, you know, some of what our Lord and Savior says is the way to a more flourishing life.
So I guess I want to press in a little too. Is there do you distinguish between hustle and hurry? Is there a good hustle and a not so good hustle, or a healthy form of hustle versus, you know, it seems to me like there could definitely be a tendency to go too much one way or the other way. How do you kind of navigate that? For sure. I think most of us probably struggle with too much, but yeah, go ahead.
Right. I think so too. I think most of us could, you know, stand to step back a little bit, but, you know, I think there can also be the sense that when we talk about a spacious life, that we're just talking about individuals and instead of a corporate like body of Christ experience. And so I don't want to be like, it's only, you know, when I talk about limits, you just get to say no to whatever you want to say no to, you know, because that isn't necessarily for our good either. And so, but at the same time, so it's not just simply individual. There's also a corporate kind of element to how we talk about what it looks like to live a spacious life. And secondarily, I don't want people exactly what you were just saying there about, does that mean I get to just like sit around and like wait for God to like zap me with fairy dust and like suddenly I'm closer to him and I think, you know, my life is better, firing on all cylinders because I took a nap? And no, you know, I think there is this combination of doing sorts of things like Bible reading, prayer, and, you know, giving and being a part of your local church body that are going to kind of till the soil. And we don't know what the God through the Holy Spirit is going to bring up. We don't know. And we don't really, we can't be responsible for the growth, but we can do things that kind of prepare the soil of our souls for growth. And so I love how Dallas Willard says that the Christian life is not opposed to effort, but it is opposed to earning. And so I think to say that, you know, having limits means that we don't work hard, because there will be seasons where you have more work to do. But a lot of it is this kind of spacious sense is more of a state of the soul based on our connection with Jesus than necessarily something that always corresponds with our circumstances.
Oh, no, you go ahead.
Yeah, no, this is good. I'm curious. Let's get practical here for a second.
Yeah.
This episode is coming out during Christmas season. How do you have a spacious Christmas season? How do you set limits and boundaries in that? Because it seems like, to me anyways, it seems like it can get really, and not even talking about in the church world, like even in what you and your husband are doing on the weekends and Sundays,
Right.
or during the week with church, but just anybody listening to this, there's family, there's get-togethers, there's expectations for shopping. I mean, how would you navigate that this season?
Yes.
Buy everyone a spacious life, and then you're all set for
there
Christmas.
You go. Done.
Boom. Presents are done.
I love that. I love it. Everyone just go buy 100 copies. Sounds
there
great.
You go.
But no, honestly, we are trying to think of some different ways of like, now that we live out of state from our extended family, is like, let's just come up with a theme, just some practical things, like just to give limits, right? To instead of, I'm going to be spending 20 hours trying to find the perfect gift, but like maybe we just get everyone a pair of socks and a book. But so that's just very practical.
Yeah.
But firstly, I am offering, it's actually an audio devotional and like a workbook called A Spacious Season on my website. So that is available for purchase. If folks want to go to aahales.com, it'll still be up in December. But, the idea behind that project really was to say, like, what does it look like practically to, engage with these things in a very busy season? And what kind of questions, a lot of it is figuring out what are our expectations that we have for this season and what are the limits of this season? Whether it's like a budget limit, of course, on gifts, the amount of time you're spending outside your home, and just taking stock of some of those sorts of things to realize, and what are your goals? Like, are your goals to do all the things and have all the fun? Or is it like, I really want to create family togetherness, or I really want to have a slower Christmas morning? And actually thinking about some of those things ahead of time, instead of just kind of finding ourselves slotted into the crazy hustle and hurry of the season, is one way that we can at least begin then to acknowledge our limits. So whether that looks like, okay, we have 3 events this week, and so the following week we need to make sure we don't schedule 8 more events. Like, we need to say no so that we can watch our Christmas movies and be in pajamas and drink hot cocoa, as a family. Those might be some ways, that we can practically choose to kind of create margin and create space in the season. So I think, a lot of people, maybe they'll buy gifts way ahead of time or go thrifting and do all of these really great things. That's not me. And like, I'm just on Amazon, but it's a lot of stress. And so to just say, okay, maybe I'm just going to, one weekend, I'm just going to order all my gifts or something, so that the rest of the season I will have time to be with people, because that's actually what I'm prioritizing. So those are a few practical ideas.
No, that's really good. What have you found that, from your own experience, like what have you found that people might not even know they're missing? Let's say, we're using let's talk about Christmas right now, Christmas season, Advent season. What are people missing by not having those limits? Like, maybe some people like being busy and hurrying, or I don't know if they do or not. I don't, right. but some people might. I don't know. Maybe, but what are they missing? What should they be thinking of that maybe they would be good to be slowing down for?
Yeah. I think, everything we're fed from commercials and Christmas movies and all of that is, it's the most wonderful time of the year. And so we are supposed to, like, how else do you understand wonderful except by like going and doing and grabbing wonderful by the horns, and getting all the wonderfulness out of the most wonderful time of the year. But most of the time, right, we find ourselves exhausted by that sort of pace. And so to say, if I want my Advent season to be something that's more contemplative, I'm going to have to say no. I'm going to have to say no to some of these things. Maybe, you make your cooking really simple so that you have more time in your day to say, okay, I'm going to take 20 minutes and read through a devotional, or, 10 minutes of silence, or we're going to spend more time around the dinner table reading through the Gospels, various different things. But those can be ways to actually help slow ourselves down, because often I think we get to Christmas and we're like, oh yeah, it's about Jesus, but I've spent all my time on things that are not of God. And so building some of those rhythms in, even just Sabbath, like a weekly Sabbath through the month of December, and having that time look different, lighting a candle, playing Advent songs, choosing to turn off screens, keeping things just a little bit more slow, even if the rest of our week looks a little bit more hurried, might be something that helps us feel like when we get to Christmas that we are ready to celebrate.
So I think I can hear some of our listeners, and maybe I'm just reading into it. There's kind of this like cycle of shame of like, I totally want to do the Advent devotional.
Right.
I'm going to be signing up for that. So I'm just telling our listeners right now, I'm signing up for that. But I want to do all of this stuff, and then I don't do it. And I'm just thinking, I recently had a conversation with a couple that she said, I felt so guilty that I didn't pray with my spouse. And I'm a pastor. I know that praying with your spouse is like really important, but I don't think the Bible even says like pray with your spouse.
Yeah.
And so I'm, as I think about this topic, and I even think about Christmas, how do you decipher the, I should watch, It's a Wonderful Life with my almost 4-year-old. Like, that's just a crazy expectation, but in our mind, we can put that in there. I mean, how do you even back up and say there's a cycle of shame for the holiday season and for life to kind of push out from there to actually know, hey, how do I simplify and limit in a healthy way?
Yeah. I think that shame and that guilt that we've kind of put on ourselves is really, it's usually not like a guilt from sin, from the Holy Spirit convicting us, right? It's kind of all of these shoulds that we've placed on our shoulders. And, really that's one reason why I wrote A Spacious Life, because we can tend to think of like, oh, we should really embrace our limits. We should kind of understand that we're finite, and we should feel our smallness before God. But especially hopefully coming out of the coronavirus pandemic, like, we need gentle invitations. We don't need necessarily more arguments about what we should and should not do. Like, we need to be pulled towards the goodness of the gospel and not just told how we're not measuring up. Yes, we do need to say, look, these patterns of your life may be sinful, but a lot of times they're not. And it's just all of these kind of unrealistic expectations we've placed on ourselves. And so I do hope that A Spacious Life is that pull into things we say we want, a life of contentment, joy, peace, and rest. And so, I think as we're wrestling with things like, I should watch It's a Beautiful Life with my 4-year-old, the question is maybe asking ourselves, like, where is this coming from? Is this a desire of my heart, or is this just kind of, I feel like I should because everyone else does it? So you just asking yourself, where is this coming from? Is this of God? Is it from the wider culture? Is it, something that we do want to prioritize in the life of our family? And, as you think about, oh gosh, I didn't complete that Advent devotional. One thing I love to come back to, my husband often uses this illustration, is, watching our little kids when they were little play soccer. And you see the parents on the sidelines, and they're like, yes, that was amazing. And they're like 3 years old, and half the kids are sitting down in the grass picking flowers, and other kids are just like running and, all just like in a pack, right, towards the goal. And you see a kid score a goal, you see a kid trying, and even just sitting there and playing in the flowers, and the parents are just so excited, right, to watch their kid do their thing. They don't have to be perfect. They don't expect them to be professional. They're just delighting in their children. And I think that's such a helpful image to remember. God delights in us like that. He gets a kick out of us. We're his kids. And he's not like, I only love you if you complete your Advent devotional. To think we are so far removed, obviously, from God's power and perfection and glory, to know that we get to be limited so we can hide ourselves in our unlimited God is a gift. And so I think, as you're feeling some of that false guilt, is to remember God gets a kick out of you. And so even doing a little bit probably pleases him greatly. And it'll, I think, then increase our hunger for doing more, for being with him more.
I want to shift. We'll probably come back to the holiday theme.
Sure.
But, you're a pastor's wife. You're also an author, and I think even just for our context, one of the tensions that we've been facing, you brought up the coronavirus in the local church. There's some people that the church is kind of the center of their communal universe. And there's other people that the church isn't, but they're a part of it. And as we've come back from the coronavirus, not just churches, but every organization is kind of asking this question, how do we get people back? So there's some people that are like, we just need to do more programs, more opportunities. And then there's other people that are just kind of saying, well, I'm really going to cut back on my life. And I guess I just kind of wonder from your perspective, from moving in the last 5 months, what would you tell churches and church leaders about thinking about a spacious life, post-coronavirus? What does that rhythm look like to invite people to be part of the family, but also not be the ones that are creating more hustle?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think we're all trying to sort that out for sure. I think the coronavirus pandemic really has revealed for most of us in the West, and definitely the American church, kind of our thin discipleship over the last few generations. I think, without kind of the church thing in the same way, we found a ton of people have left, right? That they didn't have kind of the rhythms to sustain the life of faith on their own, or in kind of virtual community. And so really, I think the church, globally can help us, but the American church has, I think we have used programs to try to keep people attending, and so ultimately I think functionally we've treated church like kind of another consumer product. You go, you do this thing, makes you feel good, and not everybody's like that. And not every church is like that. But I think on the whole, that's a little bit of what we're seeing. And so I think the challenge for the American church at this point is, how do we begin to create thicker communities? How do we begin to create kind of thicker forms of discipleship, so that hopefully the next generation has a little bit more to go on than a lot of us who have found ourselves kind of floundering in this season. And so, as we think about a spacious life and what that might look like, I think a lot of it is leaders can tend to try to kind of fill up a vacuum and fill in the gaps. And kind of faithful volunteers and lay leaders do that too, where it's like, hey, we have this need, or this would be a great thing that we're going to do. And then everyone's like, who always does the same stuff, the 80% of folks who don't tend to volunteer as much, and it's like 20% do all of the things. And so I think there's a sense in which maybe we probably just need to let there be a silence of activity maybe, and not always rush in to create a program for the need, and see who steps up. Might be really one small way that we could actually trust the Spirit of God to move. And secondly, it's really just those really boring rhythms of the Christian life. Reading our Bible, being in prayer, gathering with the local church, participating in the sacraments. These are the things that the global church has done for thousands of years. And who are we to think that, we should need a new fancy program instead of, maybe I should actually learn how to practice Sabbath as a way to experience God and to be renewed and refreshed. My husband and I were actually talking earlier today, and he was saying, someone was asking him in a staff meeting, oh gosh, you're reading First Chronicles and it's just all these names, and what do you get out of that? And he's like, well, I don't even think that's the question. We should really be asking what you get out of it. Rather, I know that by committing myself to the rhythm of reading scripture, I trust God's forming me, even if I'm not wowed by lists of genealogies. So I thought that was a really helpful reminder that, when we get to the point of suffering, the things that we have done, the rhythms that we have participated in, will be there for us kind of, in the bank, rather than feeling like we don't have any resources because we haven't done or invested in the things that God says will bring us life.
How would you, I mean, so jumping off of that, I'm curious, let's say someone is interested in having more limits,
Yep.
figuring out how to practice Sabbath.
Yep.
What does that mean? Like, what are first steps you would say someone should take, and what should they be aiming for?
Yeah. Yeah. And I think Sabbath is something, of course, people have different views on, and we can get lots of shoulds as we contemplate Sabbath. And we can also think, I need to do this like really well right off the bat, instead of having it be kind of, emerge in different seasons of life. So, I'm not going to expect someone with little kids at the home is going to be like, and I'm going to have an hour of silence, quiet time. Like, that's just not going to happen. But maybe it is that you could put your kid on your back and go for a hike, and talk about how God made nature and how beautiful that is, and isn't our God amazing? And so I think there's definitely ways that we can adapt, concepts of Sabbath. But for Sabbath, I think it's supposed to be a Sabbath to the Lord. It's not a day off. So, how are you kind of posturing your heart towards worship? And so part of that's worshiping with your local body. I tend to try to read both fiction, because it's delightful, and kind of a spiritual book during that day. We have often done like a candle at the beginning or end of the day to kind of bookend it, to feel like it's something special. And for us, we also eat dessert first. I read in one of A.J. Swoboda's book on Sabbath, he talks about how the Hebrew children were woken up with honey on their tongues, so they would always know that the Lord's Day is sweet. And I loved that. So I make sure that we have dessert on Sundays, and we have it before our dinner. So for us, I think too, that's been a really great tradition. And I think a lot of it too is to choose to bask in Sabbath as it's a gift. It's not like, oh, these are all the things you can't do. But God is saying, he gave Sabbath to his people when they were coming out of slavery. You don't have to work for your worth. You don't have to. You can actually put away the computer, and you don't have to return emails. Like, the world does not depend on you, will not continue to spin because of how present you are to your email inbox.
No, I love that. I think that's something that we definitely could all
Yeah.
think about more. The world's going to keep turning, the sun's going to keep rising and setting, whether or not we look at our email or our Twitter feed or whatever it is. But how do you, I guess to jump off of that, how have you found that you have had, just to anticipate, let's say someone's listening and they're like, I really want to make a go at that. What should they be anticipating as far as steps they can take to protect that time? There's going to be, I'm sure there's going to be people who might want their attention, but maybe even worse than that is the little pop-ups on your phone or whatever. What are your protective measures you put in place ahead of time?
Yeah. I know some people who just leave their phone off for the day, or delete social media off their phones, particularly for the weekend. And I think that's a really great, healthy rhythm. I've done that on occasion, for sure. I definitely don't post anything on social media on Sundays, because that can get that sucks me into, oh gosh, look at all of these things, that I should be paying attention to. But if it's off, you don't even know what you're missing. And yeah, or putting notifications on your email, whatever you need to do to kind of get a barrier between what is your normal work and kind of rest time, to figure out what's actually restorative rest too, is important, instead of just zoning out on Netflix or something. What are the things? I often encourage folks to create a delight list. And sometimes those delightful things are things that you can think back in your childhood that brought you delight. And so how can you incorporate maybe some of those sorts of things in your Sabbath keeping? And, the candle or something like that might be helpful, to be this is the beginning of my Sabbath time, and this is the end, to give you a boundary as well to that time.
That's cool. Yeah. Peter, what's on your delight list from when you were a kid?
I was about to say grape soda, but I feel like I'm going to be judged.
I'm going to go with Legos. Yeah, there you go. All right, go ahead.
Yes. So yeah, maybe you want to build something or have your grape soda. That's awesome.
Hey, nothing tastes better than Dimetapp. Not the actual stuff. We're not promoting that.
Right. Right.
probably the chapter that affected me the most in the book was on death. And so when we talk about death, it's not, it's more figurative than literal. And again, I'm kind of dancing on words here. What do you think that we get wrong of our understanding of whether it's dying to ourselves or the death of a dream and even grieving? What do you think is our big problem, and what are you kind of saying, hey, this is an opportunity here for you?
Yeah. Well, thanks for saying that. I think, honestly, there's a chapter about Jesus in the Garden of Gethsemane and his aloneness before the Father and desiring human companionship. And as we know, his closest friends didn't show up for him. And, I think there's a sense in which we have all felt deeply alone. And I think what is beautiful, in those moments of the death of a dream or a diagnosis, is to hold both our losses and our joys together. Because ultimately we believe that because Jesus received the no of God the Father at that time, he's like, can this cup pass from me? That we will always have his yes. And so we can have the encouragement to know that whatever dark valley that we're going through, and if we don't run away from that and try to push it off or try to control it, if we actually say, this dark valley, whatever it may be, can be used for good, for resurrection, because that is the story of the Christian life, is from death to resurrection. That there is hope somehow in it, even if I can't see it, if we kind of cast ourselves on the omniscience and mercy of God in those moments, we will actually find this kind of contentment, I think, that Paul talks about, that is, in want and in plenty. He's learned that secret of being content. And I think that's really what we all want, because we know suffering is going to come, and we know that we will experience lots of smaller deaths before we get to the big death. So yeah, I think there's a sense in which we can be encouraged with the fact that Jesus has gone through death and come out the other side, that is the same pattern in our own lives. And it takes a lot of courage to stick with him. But there's folks I have talked to who've read A Spacious Life, who are in those dark valleys and who have said, both I believe, help my unbelief, and also Jesus is enough. Jesus is enough. And that brings me so much joy to know that my book could be just a small, teeny part in someone's story about really realizing in our bones sort of way that Jesus is enough.
I want to kind of flip that, because right now we're having a conversation about the Great Resignation in jobs. And I think a lot of those, you're not just running to a new opportunity, you're running from something. So even if on the other side of quote unquote death is something beautiful and positive, and you might, just from your personal experience from moving from California to Colorado, what would you say to the people that are, say, on the other side? How would you encourage them to grieve well, even though they don't feel like they're quote unquote grieving? Yeah.
Waiting is really hard. And waiting God is even harder, because it seems like he's not in a hurry. He's definitely not as quick, sometimes as I would like it to be. And of course I would love, here's the map of your life, Ashley, and you can see how all of these things fit together. But then we really wouldn't have to walk with him all that much, because we'd be like, thanks, we got it, Genie Jesus. But, I think, as we think about how to wait well and how to grieve well, I think a lot of it has to do with simply naming the grief. I think especially in COVID, the COVID era, maybe we could say, little things tend to affect us in bigger ways, and it's often surprising. So a friend of mine was talking about having to miss a field trip because it got canceled to be able to go with her daughter. And she found herself just really upset about this. And it kind of brought up some things in her own story from, a decade before that she hadn't really dealt with. And so by asking herself the question, like, why is this bothering me? Because sometimes grief comes up and we're not even aware of it. And so just taking time to get curious about our grief might be a first step. For those of us who are like type A, we're just going to hurry past our grief. Just the reminder that grief and loss and pain, if we don't deal with them, will always come out sideways. So if you don't give yourself some planned margin to begin to maybe process some of that with Jesus, it's going to come out, and it's usually not going to be pretty, the sideways sort of thing. So even just saying, I'm going to open up some space for silence or prayer on a regular basis around this loss, even if I don't feel it, might be a good way to begin to process that.
Before we get to, we ask the same question all the time. This is a question for all of us. I just thought we'd have fun. So
yeah.
What's your favorite Christmas movie?
Favorite Christmas movie is probably Christmas Vacation.
Wow. Okay.
Yeah.
What about you, Aaron?
Oh man, that's a tough choice. There's a lot of good ones. I mean, I guess what kind of mood am I in?
Yeah,
It's a
that's
Wonderful
true.
Life is a classic.
Yeah.
Absolutely. But if I'm feeling a little more goofy, I guess I would go with Elf.
I love Elf too. That's up there.
I'll just throw the Grinch out there.
Yeah. Which one?
I think the original.
Oh, right.
The original cartoon.
Right.
We don't have enough cartoons. I'm campaigning for more. And
For
maybe
more
I
Christmas
shouldn't,
cartoons.
cartoons in general,
Okay.
but maybe I shouldn't, because then my daughter would watch more of them. But anyway,
There you go.
it's a whole. We got to put some spacious life in her life, boundaries and limits
On the
so there we
screens.
go.
Yes. I hear you.
We'll save that for the next podcast, and the three of us can talk about parenting stuff.
Perfect.
So.
Sounds fun.
Well, so the question that we close every episode with is, what does Jesus have to say about this topic? So Aaron and I answer, and then we expect the guest to clean up any messes or heresy that we bring up.
Perfect.
Do you feel comfortable doing that?
Sure, I'll give it a go.
Who's going first? Is it you or me?
I can go. That's fine. I think this is a great topic. I'm really glad that we got to talk to Ashley about this. And I mean, I love the idea of finding freedom in God's good limits. Like it's such a powerful thing to think about. It's clearly something that is on God's heart for us. He does want us to somehow experience Sabbath and to experience rest and know that our worth is not based on our work. Certainly not based on our hustle and keeping ourselves busy all the time. And I think we miss a lot I miss a lot when I keep myself busy for the sake of being busy, or maybe not the sake of being busy. Maybe I'm just allowing everything else to take over my time, because it's not really necessarily at the end of the day. It's not my time. It's time that's been given to me, and there are good ways to invest it, and then there are not so helpful ways to invest it. And I do think that using, tools that we have like social media, things like that are good. But I also think that investing on scrolling, I'm using my finger up and down if I'm looking at my phone.
Yeah.
That's not necessarily useful and not the most, I should be go back to my delight list. I should be doing more Legos with my kids. So, so I think that it's very important. Go ahead, Peter.
So, like I said, I'd really encourage you to read the book. I think one of the indirect themes is this idea of freedom, because we think that that's in contrast of limits and hustle and choice and doing everything. And we brought that up a couple times. There's a book called The Paradox of Choice. And there was a section in there that they actually went into grocery stores and they had 20 selections of jellies and jams.
Yep.
And they sold less than when they put 2 out there. And I think about that because it's almost like our culture saying, please decide for me. And when you read the Old Testament with Jesus, it seems like he's so directive that God is like, you need to do this on this day, on this Sabbath. And then you get to the New Testament and it's almost as if, no, you're free from this stuff. And I think the better question is, like, what is the rhythm that Jesus wants for our life? And maybe the difference is he models it in the New Testament. Ashley brought up he took naps and things like that. And, you can respond to this episode by shame, by saying, hey, I should be reading my Bible more. I should be doing this. Or you can respond by just saying, I'm good where I'm at. But I think the challenge for us, wherever you are in your faith journey, is if Jesus is giving us a sustainable life that he's called us to live, what does that look like? And I think that that's the better question that the Bible offers and gives some examples to, and kind of unites the Old Testament with the New Testament. So those are just some of my thoughts.
Yeah.
Ashley, clean it up.
I think that's great. I think a lot of questions we come down to too is, what is freedom for? And, in our American concept, at least practically, it's, freedom is so that I can do whatever I want to do, whenever I want to do it, with whomever I want to do it with. And that's not what the Bible talks about, right? Is freedom, right? Paul reminds us it's for freedom we've been set free, and it's freedom from sin and slavery and death. And so the rhythms that freedom in Christ looks like is not going to always look like or feel like freedom to our American sensibilities, but they actually do bring life. So it would be great, maybe even just try it out, this Christmas season. What does it look like to embrace your limits like Jesus does? And just say, I'm just going to try it. See if I actually, if it actually changes this sense of always feeling like I'm missing out and this constant anxiety, or if I'm actually feeling, this is how God's made me. This is how he's invited me into his kingdom work, in my neighborhood, in my church. And so I'm going to do those things that he's called me to. And I can therefore not feel like I am a failure if I don't do the other millions of things that are calling for our attention.
That's really good. Ashley, thanks for joining us. Can people find you on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter,
yes,
LinkedIn, MySpace? No.
Or Meta now. I don't even know what Facebook is. I'm mainly on Twitter and Instagram at AA Hales, and my website is aahales.com. So that's pretty easy to remember.
And
I have a podcast too. Yeah.
Oh, what's the name of your podcast?
Yeah, it's called the Finding Holy Podcast. So, and you can find the links there at the website as well.
Well, we'll be posting about it. We'll also be posting about Ashley's Advent devotional, so be looking for that. Ashley, thanks so much for joining us, and make sure you check out her book, A Spacious Life. Just a reminder, you can find us at whygotawhypodcast.com. The best way to get in touch with us is to subscribe to our email. Each week you'll get the episode with the transcript, everything you need in there. So we hope you have a wonderful day. Thank you, Browncroft Community Church, for supporting us, and we'll go from there.